Good morning. Welcome to Sunday School from Jacob's house. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Jacob Matherly. I'm one of the student leaders here at Coyote, and I'm also one of the Sunday School teachers for our middle school boys. So, like I said, welcome to Sunday School from Jacob's house. I'm sure most of my boys that are in my Sunday school are probably not unhappy that they don't have to be at Sunday school this morning. I'm sure most of y'all like Jack and Rod and Eli and Levi and Andrew and all y'all, I'm sure, sitting in the bed at home right now, probably hadn't even showered, hadn't even eaten. Just if you're even watching this, you better be watching this because I'm going to check with your parents. And if you haven't watched it, you're going to have to do with me after that. So, a little bit different right now. I'm sure most of y'all saw the video that Coyote put out with Mr. Steve. As you know, we tried to crank things back up. We were kind of getting to normal level, and then things kind of dipped back down. So we took the necessary precaution to just, say we're going to kind of step back a little bit. We're still doing the church services and stuff, but we want to try to keep people as safe as possible. So this is what Sunday school is going to look like for this week, maybe next week. We'll kind of play it by ear and see how it goes. So, like I said before, if you haven't been to Coyote or if you're just watching one of our videos for the first time, this is the middle school boys Sunday school lesson for this morning. We, as a Sunday school with the curriculum that we're using right now, we are going through the entire book of the Bible. We started in Genesis at the beginning of the year, and we are going all the way to Revelation and just looking at all the big key stories throughout the entire Bible and looking at the timeline of from the beginning to the end, how everything has happened. So with that said, we are going to be in 2 Samuel this morning and Romans. So 2 Samuel, we're going to be in chapter 11 and 12. It will be all of chapter 11 and the first 14 verses of chapter 12. Another good thing about doing Sunday school from home is I don't have to pick on any of y'all to read. I know how much y'all love to do that in Sunday school, and this is like 40-something verses. So count your blessings that I don't have to call on you to read this morning. So I'm not going to read all of this, so if you want to pause the video right now, like I said before, we are in all of chapter 11 and the first 14 verses of chapter 12. I'm going to break chapter 11 down first, then we'll look at chapter 12, and then we will go to Romans. The verses in Romans, we are in Romans 3, 23 through 24. So, we will start in 2 Samuel, and then we will go through that, and then we will wrap up with Romans, and we will call it a day. So, chapter 11, we are looking at the story of David and Bathsheba. For those who don't know, David is the king. We won't get into David's timeline during this because it's a lot. Y'all will probably know him if you've been to church, if you've heard the stories. David and Goliath, that's the guy that we're talking about in this story. So, in this story, David is king. The kingdom right now is at war with the Ammonites, and that's where we're picking up in the story in the first couple of verses in here. It says, in the spring of that year, the time when kings went out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in the kingdom, or remained at Jerusalem. So, backstory, like I said, Israel's at war, David's the king. Most of the time, well, I'd say most of the time, probably all of the time, during scenarios like this when a kingdom goes to war, the king normally doesn't stay in the kingdom. He will travel with the army. Now, he won't be on the front lines. Now, if you've seen any of the typical war movies, like you look at Gladiator, things like that, Marcus Aurelius, which was Caesar at the time when Rome was literally ravaging half the world, Caesar would go to the battles, but he would not take part in the battles. He would stay up on top of the hill, or he would be back at the main camp while the army is on the front line. So that kind of just throws us off from the beginning of the passage when it tells us that David remained at Jerusalem. And when you start to read the passage, you will understand why. So, like I said, I'm going to paraphrase this for us real quick. So chapter 11, it essentially tells us that David is walking across one of his rooftops one morning and is looking down into the city. And if you know anything about architecture from that time period and that time of the world, the buildings were not necessarily, the houses there didn't look like the houses we have here. Most of the time it was big square blocks that were set up, and they have flat roofs on them, and they would have little walls that would come up to where, you'd be walking here, and the wall would stick up, kind of up halfway past your leg. That's what we call a parapet wall, and it keeps people from falling off. It helps with water, all that kind of stuff. So David's standing up on top of his balcony, he's looking down, and he sees this woman on top of her house, on her roof. Her name is Bathsheba, and she is getting ready to take a bath, and David's looking down at her, and she takes her clothes off, she gets in the bath, and David essentially tells the servants that are still in the palace, hey, I need you to go get this chick, bring her up here to me. So he brings her up to him. They have a nice evening together. We won't get into that part. I'll let your parents deal with that. And essentially, Bathsheba comes back to David and says, I'm pregnant. Consequences of doing bad things when you're not supposed to. So she comes back to David, and David's the king. And it's just this woman that he saw on a balcony and was like, hey, do you want to come up and hang out? And the next thing we know, she's pregnant. This woman has a husband, and her husband's name is Uriah, and Uriah is in David's army, so Uriah is not at home right now. So David finds out that Bathsheba's pregnant. He's like, what do I do? Let's get Uriah, let's bring him back. Okay, so we bring him back like a little sabbatical from war. Now, that was, I don't know back then if that was a typical thing with our army. We did that like in World War II when things got really, really bad. They would pick a couple guys, send them back home to the States for 30 days and kind of give them a rebreather, let them know they're still, this is not what your life is going to be forever. Let's bring you back. Let's get you revamped. We'll send you back out, which was kind of what David's plan was for Uriah. So he calls Uriah in. He tells him, you're doing a great job. Go home, spend some time with your wife, then we'll send you back out. So Uriah goes to his house, and right when he gets to his house, he doesn't go in. And essentially he is found sleeping on his own doorstep the next day. So David brings him back, and he's like, you've been at war this whole time. You've been sleeping in the mud, in the muck. You've been fighting. You've been killing. You're home. You have your own bed. You have your wife. Why would you not want to go spend the night with your wife? And essentially Uriah's response is, I can't willingly go in there and live like this when I know my guys are out here doing this. Good man. So strike one, David doesn't get what he wants. So we go to round two. So David's like, all right, so I can't get him to do it willingly. Let's bring him to the palace. We'll have a huge feast. We'll get him drunk. Then we'll send him back. There's no way he can say no after that. So we bring Uriah to the palace. We have a big feast. We're drinking. Uriah gets drunk. Same result. Doesn't go in. Okay. So 2 times, 2 strikeouts. David's probably at this point starting to freak out. So I'll go ahead and tell you essentially what David's trying to do here is David is screwed up. He's made a mistake, and he's trying to cover his tracks. So Bathsheba's pregnant, but Uriah's not there. So obviously, like I said, y'all can talk to your parents about this. It can't be Uriah's baby if Uriah wasn't home when Bathsheba said she was pregnant. So David's plan was, let's bring Uriah home, let's get him hammered, and let's make him not think about all the stuff that he's been doing. He's home with his beautiful wife, and we'll frame it that way. That way, when Bathsheba tells Uriah that she's pregnant, it's obviously his baby, no big deal. But David can't get it to swing that way. So now we're at strike 3. What do we do at this point? So the last alternative is David sends word to his assistant, kind of his head guy Joab, out at the front lines and says, I'm sending Uriah back. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to send him to the thickest of the thickest. Send him to the worst part of the battle. And in those days, the frontline guys, it was called the vanguard. And the vanguard these were your elite of your elite. Like imagine like 50 or 60 like Chris Murphys standing in the front line. Like that's what the vanguard was. That's where the thickest, the hardest fighting was. That's where you sent your best guys, because that's the ones that were pushing through to make headway for the battle. So David sends word to Joab and says, I want you to stick this guy right here. That's not the worst part of it. That was part 1. So he essentially is saying, put him in the worst spot and let him have at it. But the second part to the message was, when Uriah gets to that point, I want you to send him in, but I want you to pull the whole line back. And he sent him to his death is what he was doing. He was like, I can't get him to do what I want by manipulating him My only alternative is I can't let people know that I slept with this guy's wife. She's now pregnant, and I'm the king. I'm going to send him here, and Uriah gets killed. And that's kind of the first big chunk of chapter 11 is setting the stage for what David did with Uriah. That's the whole story that's in chapter 11. And then when we go to chapter 12, the Lord sends a man named Nathan to David to talk to him. So this is after Uriah's dead. Everything's over. They're back. David and Bathsheba are actually together now, and that's their son. Everything's worked out great until Nathan shows up. And what Nathan says, and I'm going to read this little part right here. I won't read all of it, but it's kind of hard to paraphrase because of the wording. So if you want to follow along, this is the beginning of chapter 12, and I'm going to read to roughly about verse 7 or 8, somewhere in there. So 2 Samuel 12, starting in verse 1. And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little lamb, which he had bought. And he bought it, and he brought it up, and it grew with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guests who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come for him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Now, this is Nathan's response. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hands of Saul. And I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing for all of Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. So I actually went through and read the whole thing. So that's chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. So this is the backlash for what has happened. So David's kind of hanging out in the palace. Everything's fine, like I said before. And the Lord sends Nathan. And if you haven't gone to church before, if you're a newcomer to church, one of the things that I love about the Bible and the stories is when the Lord teaches someone a lesson, it's not like what you would expect. It's not like when you get in trouble with your parents, you're goofing off, you're messing off, your mom gets mad, and she's like, all right, you better wait because dad's getting ready to come home. And I know what that meant when I was a kid. That meant I was getting ready to get a beating when I got home because I had disobeyed my mom. But that's not really, sometimes that's how the Lord acts in the Bible. There is strict, I use the word vengeance lightly. That's because that's not really a good word to use. The Lord is a vengeful God, but not in the vengeful sense, like sin and that kind of stuff. Anyways, so the Lord always speaks in what we call parables or stories. So the Lord has sent this guy named Nathan to David to tell him this story. And David, the veil is so thick with David because of what he's just done. Nathan essentially tells him this story. This is exactly what you just did. But David can't see it. And he gets so mad, like, he needs to repay it fourfold. This man needs to die. How could he do this? And Nathan's sitting there and he just looks at him and he's like, dude, this is you. The Lord sent me to tell you the story because this is you. This is what you have done. And that's when David realizes, the veil is lifted and he's like, what have I done? I've literally killed a man because I lusted after his own wife and now I have a child with her and I killed him so I could take that away from him. So essentially that's the main chunk of the story from chapter 11 and chapter 12. So what does that have to do with Sunday school, what we're learning about? Essentially, this passage and what we're learning about today is sin has consequences. I know we all know that. I don't think at y'all's age yet you fully understand the level of depth that the consequences that come from sin, and you will learn that as you get older. So what we can see in here is David has done all this stuff wrong. He thinks he's free and in the clear. Nathan sends him. Nathan is sent by the Lord, tells him the story, and like I said, the veil has been lifted, and the consequences, all of this work, everything that you've done, the baby that David and Bathsheba have actually gets sick and dies, and that is the consequence of the sin. So I want you to turn real quick. We're almost done to Romans. We're in chapter 3, and we are in verses 23 and 24. If you are, I know I say this all the time to my guys in Sunday school, I try to give them stuff to read. If you're looking for something to read in the Bible right now, if you don't have a good quiet time that you're going through, the book of Romans, I will preface, the book of Romans is very deep. There's a lot of stuff in Romans. Romans was written by Paul. A lot of stuff to unpack. You could spend almost an entire year just reading the book of Romans over and over again because there's so much in here. There's so much to unpack. We won't get into that today, but this is one of the big verses that's in Romans that we all like to come back to and use for Sunday school, for church, for lessons, because it's a great verse. So Romans 3, 23 and 24. So, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. So that's pulling that little snippet out of chapter 3. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So what I want to wrap everything up and explain to you is, so the story that we just read, this is the king of Israel. This is David. And in the Bible it tells us David is a man after God's own heart. That's the book of Psalms was written by David. He was a great, wise man, but I think the whole reason why the story of David and Bathsheba is in the Bible and why we can link it back to Romans 3, 23 and 24 is, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I have sinned. Jack, which if you don't go to Kauke, if you don't know, Jack Dodge is our student pastor here at Kauke. Steve Hartman is our pastor. Any of our deacons, you pull any of the big names out of Kauke, every single one of those guys has sinned. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So if we can take our pastor, we can take the king of Israel at the time, we can take anybody, and this verse will still apply to them. There are no rungs to climb. There are no, well, I did this sin and, it really wasn't that bad, but, David did this sin and literally killed a guy just so he could have his wife. That's kind of the point of what we're reading this morning is, all have sinned and fall short. No sin, and me personally, I struggle with this concept. It's one of the things on my list that I want to talk to God about when I get to heaven, because I don't understand it. Sin, and you've been taught this from day one, sin is sin. There is no one sin that is greater than another. All sin is the same in God's eyes. So I could leave this house right now and go out and kill somebody, and someone could be, one of you guys could be at your house and you could talk back and disrespect your mother, and those two sins are identical. It's a hard concept to wrap your brain around, that I could go and murder somebody and you could talk back to your mom, and in God's eyes, those two sins are here with each other. I'm not here, you're not here, they're here. So it's a difficult one to wrap your head around, but that's just how God labels it, and God is God, and that's just how we have to accept it and take it. And it's really a good thing, because if we viewed sins on different levels, I think this is probably why he does it, we might be more prone to commit more sin, if that makes sense. So if God was to say, murder is tier 1 sin, stealing and beating somebody up is tier 2 sin, and then if you go into your sister's room and, like take her book and run away to like make her mad or irritate her, like that's like a tier 3 sin, like, okay, that's not that big deal. I think if he labeled them that way, we might be more prone than we already are to sin, because we're prone to sin almost every second of every day of our lives, because that's how we are. That's how we're made. So I think that's probably the way he does it for that reason, so that if we see sin as equal, we might in our minds think, no matter what I do, this is a sin and this is wrong in God's eyes, if that makes sense. So like it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, whether it's David, whether it's us, all of us have sinned, all of the sin is the same. No man is better or worse because of the sins that he has committed, if that makes sense. But here's the great part about the second part of the verse. And are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is Christ Jesus. So if we, like it said back in 2 Samuel, Nathan says to David, you are forgiven for this. You will not die. That won't be what happens. You don't have to fear that, because Jesus has paid the price for us. But I think the key thing to pull out of this, like it says at the end, yes, you have done this, but here's what's getting ready to happen. Your kid's going to die. So I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is, like I said before, sin is sin. There is no one greater sin than another. There is not a greater man or a greater woman when it comes to sin and acts, if that makes sense. Like, David won't be treated any less or any greater because he was a king than Joab or Uriah or somebody would have been treated for the sins that they committed. Sin is sin, and we will be punished for it. There are consequences for your sin. Now, that's the other thing that it's hard to grasp and understand. Sometimes the consequence for your sin is immediate. Let's take, for example, if you're out one night and like a guy's driving around and he's drunk, he crashes, runs into somebody, kills somebody, that's an immediate consequence to that sin. There could be sins that don't come to light for years because of the way that the events happened, anything like that. Like with Uriah, if God hadn't have wanted to punish David in that way, he could have been with Bathsheba, they could have had the kid, he could have grown up, and life would have been great. David would have thought he got away with it, and that consequence could have shown up 10, 15 years down the road. So I guess the point to pull out of that is there will always be a consequence for your sin, always. Just because Jesus has died on the cross and your sins have been washed away by his blood does not mean you will not be punished for what you have done. That's not how it works. You are forgiven, but that you still are held accountable for what you do, if that makes sense. So I know that's a lot. It's a big story to unpack. Really, this story right here, you could sit down and probably talk about it for 2 or 3 hours, just what David did with Uriah, and then when Nathan comes and talks to him tells him the story, this is essentially you, God has sent me to tell you, you screwed up and here's the consequence. But it's a good story to look at. It's an easy one to kind of unpack real quick and say, this is what happens when we are tempted by sin. Here's what happens when we commit sin and we become afraid of it and we're scared that we don't want anybody to know about the sin that we committed, and therefore we start to commit more sins. That's the other thing. When David decided he was going to invite Bathsheba up to the palace, from that point on, the sins just stacked and stacked and stacked and stacked. And that's another thing that you have to understand about when you sin and you don't confess to it immediately, that it's right here, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and you start to find out the more you try to cover up the one sin that you have committed, you start to pile on even more trying to cover that one up. So that's kind of good to pull out when you look at the story of David. And then, like I said, you get to Nathan, and Nathan essentially says, dude, God's calling you out big time. Here's what happened. You are forgiven, but here's the consequence for it. So that's kind of the big picture. We will sin. There will be consequences of sin, but you are forgiven. All fall short, but I love that part of that verse. All fall short, but you are washed away by the blood of Christ. So, all that in a nutshell. It's a good story. If you have any questions, comments, I'm not really sure where this is going to be put up. I'm sure it'll probably be on the Calligraphy website. I don't know if it'll make it to our Instagram, Facebook, anything like that. If you have any questions about this, send us a message on Instagram. You can send us one on Facebook. If you want to call, talk to one of your leaders about anything right now. I know, like I said in the beginning of the lesson, everything's kind of up in there, flipped upside down right now. If you ever need anybody to talk to, we are here. You can, like I said before, you can message us on our Instagram, on our Facebook. You can go to our website. It's kyoki.org and look on there. All of our leaders' information is on that website. The church phone number, email, all that. If you want to get in touch with one of your leaders, shoot somebody at the office an email. Jeff Meeks is our administrator. Shoot him an email, call him at the office, say, hey, I want to talk to Jacob. I want to talk to Cliff. I want to talk to Randy. I want to talk to John, one of the guys in my Sunday school class, about the lesson. They have our contact information. They will get back to you with that. You can call us, text us, FaceTime us, whatever. And you can ask us about what we went over in the lesson today. So that's it from me. We love y'all guys. We miss y'all. We hope everything's going great. We hope to see you again soon. No more football to talk about, unfortunately. So the next time that we're together, we'll talk about that absolute slaughter of Ohio State, who, like we all said from the beginning, never deserved to be in there. But that's a topic for another time. That's all I got for you today. Like I said, my name's Jacob. If you need anything from us, call us, text us, email us. We love you guys, and we will see you soon. Thank you.